Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dawn of Drones. I'm Dawn Zoldi, your host and the CEO of P3 Tech Consulting. So great to have you. We are in the middle of Defenders Month, and what a month it has been. We kicked it off with drone responders. Last week we were live in North Dakota with Brigadier General retired and now President of UND, Andy Armacost, and Northrop Grumman. And today we are so honored to have with us Brigadier General Houston Cantwell, coming to us live from Italy, part of the NATO forces there, the commanding general there at Vicenza, Italy, where they have the drone forces. So Houston, so great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Dawn, it's great to see you after a couple of years, and I look forward to chatting about drones because there's so much to talk about.
Absolutely. So for everybody out there, and by the way, you know, I know most of you that are out there know this is live, so please drop your comments, your questions in the chat, your positive encouragement. Tell us where you're coming from. We love to see all of that. Just a little bit of background. General Cantwell and I were actually assigned together at the United States Air Force Academy. So last week I had General Armacost, who was our dean. General Cantwell was our vice superintendent. So I was also one of his lawyers, and so great to see him after all this time. And now he's out in NATO doing amazing things. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about your background, Houston, and how, first let's talk about your Air Force career and what led you up to this point.
Yeah, Dawn, I was one of those guys that started out flying manned aviation. And they did not have the RPA only track back in the day. And then after flying F-16s for about 17 years of my career, then I got tracked over to MQ-9s. I did MQ-9s as a group commander, then MQ-9s at Holloman as the schoolhouse commander. And then now I'm flying the RQ-4 Global Hawk here in Italy.
All right. And I remember you and I went out one day for a coffee when we were together at the Academy there in Arnold Hall, and you shared with me a story about somewhat about your inspiration getting involved in what the Air Force calls remotely piloted aircraft or drones. Can you share with us that story?
Yeah, so I was taking a break from flying the F-16, getting a master's degree at George Washington. And while I was at George Washington, I was an intern in the Pentagon. And in August of 2001, I went to my boss and I said, "Hey, boss, I've heard about these unmanned aircraft, these Predator things that are over at Indian Springs. Since I'm an intern and my job is to learn about stuff, how about you funding me to go out there to go learn about what these Predators are about?" And he's like, "Are you sure this isn't just a boondoggle to get out to Vegas?" And I'm like, "No, sir, I swear, I'm interested in these things. They sound fascinating. I'm gonna go talk to the people that are doing this." So sure enough, he finds a couple grand and flies me out there on September 7th, 2001.
Wow.
This is September 7th, 2001. I'm in Indian Springs. I got a case of beer under each arm, Captain Canttwell, walking into the 11th Reconnaissance Squadron and introducing myself. And I will never forget that day and a half I spent at Indian Springs meeting all of these young airmen who were bringing this new technology to life. And it was amazing to see them on the cutting edge, but it was also amazing to just feel the atmosphere, because it was not a great atmosphere, to be totally honest. Back in 2001, everyone there was non-volunteered to go fly unmanned aircraft from manned aircraft. And so there were a lot of tales of woe about, "Oh, this is how I got here. I got stuck here. I used to fly B-1s. Now I got to do this." And I will never forget how much tales of woe there were. And that really helped form my opinions on the importance of bringing of an independent career field, which is now called the 18X career field in the Air Force, to fruition. I flew back from Indian Springs that weekend, went to work at the Pentagon on the 10th on Monday. And then on the 11th, obviously the rest is history. And then from that day, I've just seen the relative importance of this technology grow throughout my career. And I feel so honored to have been a part of it for the last 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, this idea that people were they basically were told that from manned aircraft they had to go over there. But what a difference drones made right from the beginning, after 9/11 happened. And, we went downrange, frankly, hunting bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. We're actually tomorrow on our clubhouse, which is the Drone Law Connections Clubhouse, going to have Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Phelps from retired Marine Corps, wrote the book on killing remotely. So everybody out there, join us, because he's going to be talking tomorrow at 11 a.m. Mountain, 1 p.m. Eastern, about his experience right there, one of the first ones on the ground, employing these large drones in support of that effort. And so that's probably a great transition. Let's talk a little bit about, you've watched this from the beginning. You were there, at Indian Springs just a couple days before 9/11. And, eventually you became part of this became a career field. Let's talk about what you observed as these aircraft were being employed on the battlefield and the kind of difference they were making right from the start.
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the most fascinating and I think proudest part of the whole community is how quickly they were able to innovate in so many ways. I'll never forget, after I did the introduction to Indian Springs, I went back and flew F-16s. And after F-16s, I get sent back to the classroom for Air Command and Staff College and SAS. And while I was there, I committed to writing a couple theses on the development of unmanned aircraft. And that allowed me to learn all this history. And some of the most amazing pieces of this is I got to meet some of the people that did it, whether it was the operators, the sensor operators, or the policymakers in the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, ACC commanders, wing commanders, all those folks that helped shape how this technology developed. But one of the greatest stories is always the one about how we armed the Predator. When the Predator first started, they're flying around Afghanistan and it's strictly ISR because there were no weapons on it. And what happens
is
they
cut in
see
for 1 second. ISR is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Just for people that don't have a military background, we tend to use a lot of acronyms in the military.
Yeah. So we've got these. It was literally within weeks we get these drones over Afghanistan to start looking for the terrorists. And there's a very famous clip of a tall, thin man with a beard that actually they catch on Predator video, and they didn't have a weapon. So by the time they, get through the C2, the command and control chain, and they get a shooter in the vicinity, he's gone.
Too late. So, it was Osama, right?
Yeah.
This was
that's
Osama bin Laden. Almost right from the get-go, they had eyes on this guy and they couldn't get him.
Yeah, but the problem is we didn't have weapons on board, and so you couldn't close the kill chain, which is what helped inspire them. That event, and then a lot of stuff that happened in Kosovo, which is another place where we used them in the beginning. They said, hey, we got to close the kill chain. And General Jumper was one of the people who was like, hey, we're going to arm these things, take $1 million, and, let me know how it goes. That's when he was in Europe. He gets to ACC command, now he's in charge of a lot of organized, train, and equip. And he asks, hey, how's that project with the arming of the drones? And everyone's like, oh, you were serious about that? He's like, yeah, damn right, I was serious. And so people start really working on this. And within a couple months, which is an unbelievable timeline, they arm this thing and they shoot the first Hellfire off the wing of a Predator in the desert in Nevada. And if you talk to Snake Clark, he'll tell you, all about some of the work that went behind the scenes for that.
Yeah, just absolutely incredible. And for those out there that aren't familiar, ACC is Air Combat Command, and General Cantwell just mentioned organized, train, and equip. So, the way the services are set up is that's what they do. They organize and train and equip the military forces and then give them over to the combatant commands to actually do the war fighting, which is why those operations are joint. And their coalition, which is maybe a great segue to talk a little bit about the coalition environment. So let's talk about where you are now. There's so much to talk about in between, of course, but let's talk about where you are now and the position you're holding, exactly what it is and what you're doing there in Italy.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm the commander of NATO Alliance Ground Surveillance Force, and we have just short of 400 personnel contributed by 24 different NATO countries, all coming here to Italy. We're actually at Sigonella in Sicily, which is known as the hub of the the hub of the Mediterranean, because we are literally a very strategic location. North Africa, all of Europe, we can range, any part of our area of responsibility for NATO. And with the 400 people, our primary role is to produce intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance products, whether that's pictures or other types of products for decision makers up in the NATO headquarters. And we actually can do the processing of any high altitude aircraft. So we do U-2, we do US Global Hawk, we get some of their feeds and do processing of that. But of course, we also fly our own version of the RQ-4 Delta Global Hawk. We call it the Phoenix aircraft here at NATO. And we fly that. We just got our first aircraft in November of 2019. And
Wow.
then 7 months later, flew the first mission in June of 2020. And so we've been flying aircraft for about a year. And we just declared initial operating capability in February, which meant that we have, the basic capability to maintain the aircraft, launch the aircraft, download the data through all the satellite links, process the data, and then upstream it through the chain of command up through Air Command, which is up at Ramstein. And it's been a tremendous, unbelievable ride. All of the countries provide supremely talented individuals, whether it's aircraft maintainers, communications specialists, pilots, sensor operators, transportation, logistics experts, you name it, they all work here at NATO AGS.
Well, you just listed a whole bunch of people that contribute to these missions. And, I dwell a lot now, obviously, on the commercial side. And as people are looking at how this industry is going to evolve, all of those kinds of, let's call them career fields or talents, are also going to be needed on the commercial side. So, there's always that nexus between the DoD and the commercial side. And the DoD usually does it first, gets it right, and then, it translates so well oftentimes onto the commercial side.
Yeah, let me comment on that, Don, because you bring up a great point on the big UAV side, whether it's RQ-4s or MQ-9s. I have been surprised how quickly the contractor-owned, contractor-operated capabilities grew. Now, a lot of that was downrange operations, but whether it's a pilot, aircraft maintenance, communications specialist, there were large numbers of contractors, exactly what you just said, who are contributing to the war in what could arguably be, combat responsibilities, and doing it as a contractor in a combat zone. And it was just surprising to me to see that so close to air power in a downrange situation by contractors.
Well, and I think what you're going to see is some of those aircraft becoming civil aircraft in the future, and kind of what can they contribute, to the nation in some, short of defense, right? Other than defense. And, whether it's providing incident awareness and assessment for natural disasters for federal agencies like FEMA, or maybe even private companies, right, that can benefit from that technology. So I think the future is wide open on this. But getting back to your IOC, or initial operating capability, usually an FOC, which is final operation capability, will follow that. What is that going to look like, if you can share, and kind of what's that timeline?
Yeah, of course. So we're looking at FOC probably 3 years from now. And the big difference between now and then is we're going to grow in numbers of personnel. We have just short of 400 now. We'll bump up to about 600 personnel. And it'll give us much more capability to produce more aircraft, to fly more often. And there's a beautiful 100 million euro facility, our final operating facility that will house about 400 personnel for the headquarters. that's here on the base, and it should be complete this summer. And then we're going to take about a year to get it ready to actually be used for the operation of the aircraft. It brings in a new challenge. There's so many unique aspects to unmanned aircraft. The building is going to have a cockpit, right? For better terms, it's going to have a cockpit in it. So the Italian Airworthiness Authority has to come in and has to certify part of our building to be airworthy. And so obviously that's not going to be a short process. So we'll use our existing facility until the new facility can be 100% declared airworthy. But that's going to be a significant muscle movement for that.
Well, you and I were talking before we went live here about when we talk about challenges, the legal and regulatory and policy issues in a coalition environment. Just incredible. This is one, right? This idea that, in the United States, I know because I was at Air Combat Command helping them kind of work through what are the rules for domestic use of airspace as the birds were coming back, from Iraq and things like that. We had to work with the FAA. Clearly you're having to work with the Italian Civil Aviation Authority, and I imagine abiding by EASA regulations to a certain extent. And then add to that all the different nations you just mentioned and their, let's call them caveats, right, to rules of engagement or how they can operate. So I don't know if you want to comment on that a little bit, just how to juggle all of these different interests to be able to do these kind of operations in a coalition environment.
Yeah, there's two important aspects to that. Number one, hats off to the Italian government for stepping up to take responsibility for the airworthiness certification of the platform. It looks like a Global Hawk, but a lot of the guts, a lot of the computers are different. They're created by Airbus, they're created by Leonardo. So it is a different aircraft than Global Hawk. We didn't just take the US system, which has an airworthiness certificate through the United States. We didn't do that. It's a new system, had to be declared airworthy by the Italian government. So tremendous responsibility on their part. Number two, the NATO headquarters has got a division that handles airspace issues. And they have really led the effort on making sure that whether it's diplomatic clearances or whether it's what the specific rules are that we're going to follow as we operate over European airspace, they've done a tremendous job paving the way for us so that we can focus on operations while they focus on all of the, like you said, the bureaucracy that comes with flying unmanned aircraft. And I think you brought up a great point. On the US side, one reason why we've seen such capability growth in the military is that in a combat zone, there are far fewer rules and far fewer people are willing to take more risk. So yeah, go fly the unmanned aircraft and see what happens. You talk about FAA where there's, thousands of airliners flying and there's lots of people living underneath, then people get very concerned. And so we haven't seen the same kind of growth in the civil sector because of a lot of the bureaucracy and the rules, which exist for very good reasons. But nonetheless, they're there, which are going to slow the progress of a lot of the civil capabilities.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that as you fly over Europe, right, you're flying over different nation states, and as you said, you have to kind of coordinate with all of them. I know that's kind of an ongoing conversation here. It's not nation states; it's just our states, and this idea of aviation rights and how that's going to, with this patchwork quilt of rules and how this is all going to work. But the point is, while cumbersome and maybe not always super quick, it's working. You're able to do these operations. So I think, again, the military as a template for what could be on the civil side and lessons learned that we could really look closely and kind of adopt even here in the United States domestically. I want to note that we have a comment in the chat here. Let's see. Hello, General. Which class UAS do you feel are the greatest emerging threat in your area of responsibility?
As far as threats go, I would certainly say, like any other, we hear about the stories downrange. It's the micro, it's the small UAS. There's so much creativity that is going into those small systems, and they have so much capability for such a small price point. that there's certainly a lot of concern on those. I don't deal with a lot of that personally, but I can tell you when Dawn and I were at the Air Force Academy, we brought the Intel Corporation out there, and they flew their networked drones for us, and they flew 500 of them at one time. And I sat there on the terrazzo during the daytime test, and they flew the 500 drones above my head, and I looked up, and they were in a perfect grid pattern, just hovering there at about 200 feet. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, if you armed these things, you could do some really horrible things to anything in this vicinity. And there's nothing that we could do about it because they're so small. If you shot at them, it'd have to be some kind of electromagnetic kind of thing. But the capabilities of those 500 drones would have been unbelievable for some creative people.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our folks out there, if you missed last week, we had Northrop Grumman on talking about their MACE, M-A-C-E. It's an acronym. I don't remember what it stands for right now, honestly, but it's their counter UAS system that they are employing overseas. And that's one, of course, several. Domestically, we have folks like White Fox Defense Technologies, who was the sponsor of the month for our August series of podcasts. So still thankful to them. But yeah, counter drone remains an issue and one that whether on the battlefield, very significant, of course, but even domestically, something we need to solve to make sure that people are comfortable with what's going to be happening in the air above them. And we got to thank you, sir, out there as well there, General Cantwell. We're talking about some of these positive developments. I'd like to kind of stick with that thread a little bit because you gave some props to the Italian Civil Aviation Authority. What are some other positives developments you're seeing across the coalition force when it comes to drones that maybe we can talk about a little bit? Maybe your top 3 positive things that you're seeing in the last year or so.
Yeah, I'll say I was just at a conference in London talking about drones across the coalition, and a couple things I learned. Number one, the various nations, which have their own, like you said, caveats, concerns, are becoming more open to the use of medium and high altitude drones by their governments for military and civil use. And so that, in itself is progress. The fact that they're recognizing them and they're willing to invest money in them. And then additionally, some of the governments, which have been very reticent about arming of the drones, are actually looking at armed versions of these medium altitude aircraft, which in the past has been completely verboten. And I got to make a comment on that because I hear so many people talk about, the ethics of arming drones and people, I'd love to get into a debate eventually with people about this, but I look at it as the natural progression of military arms. Thousands of years ago, someone had a baseball bat, so I got a sword, right? And then I could be farther away from the guy with the baseball bat. And then they got a bow and arrow. Okay, and then the guy that's trying to kill the guy with the bow and arrow, he got a rifle. And then the rifle got a cannon, right? We're always trying to distance ourselves from the enemy so that I can hurt them, they cannot hurt me, okay?
Right.
In my F-16, I'm orbiting over the battle space in Afghanistan when I flew those, 25,000 feet.
Yeah.
It is an extreme version of, mano-a-mano, but they can't reach up to me. I can certainly reach down to them. And now with an unmanned technology, now I am removing myself by 5 to 10,000 miles from the battle space, but I'm still making all the decisions that a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot would make in the employment of those weapons. I'm just distancing myself from the enemy further than I ever have before.
Yeah, that's exactly what Wayne Phelps talks about in his first chapter of the book on Killing Remotely, this progression of arms and this idea of kind of removing yourself so far from the battlefield. And frankly, the unique challenges that come with that to the people involved in those operations, right? That's kind of what he dedicates most of this book to. It's one thing when you and I were just talking, Houston, you're locked down on the base, whether, in Italy because of COVID or, in a deployed environment, that's what you're doing 24 hours a day. You might get to Zoom, with your family occasionally, right? Or if you're lucky, like to be in Italy with your family, possibly with you. but mostly, you know, you're by yourself, you're in this environment and you're just focused on that mission. Imagine doing that, as you said, at Indian Springs or in a trailer. And, you know, when your shift is over, going home and coaching your kids, you know, baseball game. And that's just a really, I think, unique, I don't want to call it a challenge, it's a unique situation where people have to kind of turn things on and off pretty routinely. Whereas when you're on the battlefield, when you're deployed to Afghanistan or Kuwait or Iraq, you're just in it full time and you leave. And of course, there's always challenges when you come home as well. But to kind of have that shift mentality, I think is really unique to RPA operators and something that I think people are now, I think it's more open now, that does have impacts on people. That just because they're sitting far away from it doesn't mean it isn't real. And those feelings and those, you know, when you push a button and you're basically employing lethal force, you know, this isn't a video game. And I do believe strongly that those airmen, you know, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine that are doing this work, which is hard work in support of our nation, you know, they have kind of a unique situation that we've put them in, I think.
Yeah, Dawn, the other aspect that gets lost in the conversation, I love how you point out the shift, right? You got to, you know, mentally compartmentalize each parts of your day, but also the duration.
Yeah.
Normally in our military in the last 20, 30 years, you get mentally prepared for the deployment, you prep, you deploy, it's 4 to 6 months, maybe 9 months, you come back. It's a temporary thing. The poor folks at Creech are there for 3 to 4 years. And that is a totally different challenge to have to do that for years at a time, going through those mental gymnastics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great point. I have never really thought about that. And yeah, so it's one thing if you're gone even for a year on a deployment, or even Navy, you know, the sailors and the Marines that are on ships, they're of limited duration. They're not usually out there for 3 or 4 years, you know, doing what they're doing. So, wow, unbelievable. All right, so we talked about some of the threats. Let's talk about future trends maybe you're seeing on the use of drones in the battle space. You know, we know where we're very successfully used for surveillance, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. We've put Hellfire missiles on them, very successful in taking out a lot of really bad guys that are out there wanting to, you know, harm Americans and of course our coalition partners. What are you seeing kind of for the future for the employment on our side of the fence of drones going forward?
Dawn, that is the $1 million question. That is the $1 million question that everyone wants to know. But here's the thing I want to share. And that is the United States Air Force has done an unbelievable job building the most capable unmanned, whatever you want, unpersoned, uncrewed force in the history of mankind. It's true. The ability to gather so much information, go through the OODA loop, orient, decide, act, ability to inflict effects on the enemy faster than ever before. It is unbelievable what the United States Air Force has built using these technologies. But when you take a step back, you can tell, and this is a double-edged sword, it's been completely done through the eyes of an airman, someone who grew up flying manned airplanes. Everything we do looks and smells like how we flew aviation in the 20th century. Everything that we do.
Right.
And my point is that we have done a great job growing what I will say, you know, the Army, the Navy, the Marines could never build the force that we've done because we applied the aircraft maintenance principles, we applied the flying safety principles that we in the U.S. Air Force have just, it's in our culture. And through those principles, built this unmanned force that has more capability than ever before. The next challenge will be identifying what are the differences between unmanned and manned aviation And how do you leverage those differences to then have an advantage over your adversary? That is the fundamental question. What are the differences that we can leverage? Because those differences, whether it's, we've certainly seen that persistence is one of the things that you can do in unmanned versus manned that is completely different. You look at altitude. I think the future of unmanned is in the 50 to 100,000 foot realm.
Oh,
I don't know
wow.
how you stay up there, but I know that there's no weather. It's pretty calm up there. You can hang out for long periods of time. There's plenty of solar capability up there, and your ability to, collect information. It's like being, a very low Earth orbit satellite. But we got to find a way to stay up there for persistence. And then, of course, the micro capabilities. Obviously, a person cannot fit on a micro UAV. So that's the difference there, is that you can have these swarms of small aircraft that are able to have some type of effect on your adversary. So I see those as two areas for future exploration.
Yeah, I mean, look, even on the commercial side, we're talking about the dull, dirty, dangerous jobs, kind of offloading them to drones. And you're seeing all kinds of really novel applications. I think on the military side, General Cantwell, I did see that an unmanned aircraft was used to refuel a manned aircraft recently. I don't recall. I think that was us. I don't recall exactly who did it.
Yeah, it was the U.S. Navy. And
It was the Navy. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, they're running with that capability. I think it's great.
Yeah, so to the extent that, yeah, and I know, like, of course, the United States Air Force, AFWorks, and their Agility Prime effort, they're doing so much to remove men and women from the battle space when they don't need to be there. Like, for example, personnel recovery. Let's get a large drone or an eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff landing aircraft like Transcends Vi, as an example. Fly that thing with maybe one PJ on board, to be able to rescue that downed, soldier, sailor, airman, marine during that golden hour, that hour where if someone's injured on the battlefield, if you get them back to medical treatment, their likelihood of survivability just skyrockets, as opposed to the longer it takes, the less likely, they'll have a successful outcome. So those are two things I'm thinking about. I don't know if you're tracking this, General Cantwell, but last week in North Dakota, it was Senator Hoeven actually that announced this new sky range concept, which was so cool. So, we have the ranges, like the ground ranges, like China Lake, which is a Navy facility. Well, right now, not only ground, but when they test hypersonic missiles, they have to line up a bunch of Navy ships in the ocean. It costs a whole bunch of money, takes a lot of time, and it flags to our adversaries, look what we're doing. They're modifying the Northrop Grumman's Global Hawks to become these range hawks, where they're
that's
gonna.
what that was for.
Yeah,
I saw
they're
a
gonna.
snippet. I didn't know why do you need them? But that
Yeah,
makes sense.
they're gonna launch those things with a hypersonic missile and then launch the missile airborne from the sky. So that's what they're doing right now in North Dakota. They just got that kind of capability or the direction to go ahead and do that. They're going to do that at Grand Sky. So that's just another example of some of the future, I think, that we're going to see on the battle space. First will be R&D, and then beyond that, all the different applications. I mean, we always say the sky's the limit. It's really the space is the limit. Because as you said, the higher up in the atmosphere we can get. I mean, heck, wasn't it a drone that they just put on Mars? that was technically a drone. So, this connection between unmanned aircraft and space, I think, is also something that people don't quite appreciate, but it's huge, and it is the future.
Yeah, Don, I always tell people that our RPA pilots have as much in common with our satellite drivers as they do with pilots. Now, of course, not everyone agrees with me, except for, our RPA folks. We use Bernoulli's principles, and the satellite drivers use Kepler. It's just a different set of scientific rules. But
Right.
they're unmanned vehicles doing things persistently.
Absolutely. Well, we have a question out there for you, General Cantwell. I believe this is the question. I believe the next progression in this evolution is the integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning into unmanned aircraft systems. When do you see us feeling comfortable with semi-autonomous weaponized UAS? I mean, I think I can partially answer that. We kind of have that now.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
right?
I totally agree.
Yeah. So I'll let you please elaborate and explain.
Yeah, I totally agree. What's his name? Peter Singer does a great job talking about that in his Wired for War book, about how that evolution, even 10 years ago when he wrote the book, does a really good job of talking about that evolution. But so much of what, even the aircraft that I fly, which are somewhat primitive in terms of AI or in terms of automated capabilities, MQ-9s, RQ-4s have a lot of automation in them. Now they don't have, I think what you're getting at is the classification of targets, of friend or foe, and then the decision to employ weapons or not employ weapons. Those decisions still have a lot of work to be done, but I know there's a lot of work being done on those kinds of things to be able to parse through huge amounts of data to be able to then maybe focus the human analyst on what might be the final decision to employ or not employ. But I think we are making a lot of progress on that. And it's going to be essential because whichever side, the adversary side or our side, figures out how to parse through these huge amounts of information faster. But I talked about the ethics of unmanned aircraft. I think that there's no questions about that. It's purely ethical the way we're doing things now. Once you get machines into deciding about the use of force, now I think you've crossed into a whole new realm of ethical questions that we have not thought clearly through. A lot of deep thought needs to be taken on this in the use of machines in making these, these decisions. Where does the human need to stay on the loop? I think there's a lot of room for discussion on that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, Dawn.
Yeah, absolutely. I was at Duke Law, Major General retired Charlie Dunlap is out there, runs the Center for Law, Ethics, and National Security. And they celebrated their 25th anniversary of their Lens National Security Conference this past February when you were just doing your IOC. And I had a fireside chat with Dr. Missy Cummings. Dr. Cummings, I can't even go on and on about her credentials, but she was a Navy pilot. She's this Uber, engineer, and she's written extensively about this idea that, right now the technology, especially the, the AIML, it's not to the point where it can distinguish to such a level that any of us should be comfortable with, a machine making a targeting kind of decision. So she talks about for static things, for something you can plan for, that, much more acceptable, but for in a dynamic environment, we're just not there yet from a technology standpoint. And so I commend everybody to go to my website, P3 Tech Consulting. I think I posted up that Duke video on my webinar tab. It was such a fun interview, and she's done a ton of writing. So check out Dr. Cummings. But no, and General Cantwell, I think you already know this, right? The DoD has a working group. They're sorting through ethics on these issues. And I don't see humans coming out of the loop anytime soon. I think that's kind of the red line right now. And, let's maybe shift gears. We don't have too much time, but this idea that, and you alluded to this earlier, that drones are somehow different. I know when I was at ACC, we were getting a lot of concern that people oh, what are the special rules? What are the special law of war rules that apply to drones? Well, there's no special rules. I mean, it's the law of war. It's international humanitarian law. It's what we do every day with every other weapon. Those concepts of distinction and proportionality and necessity, so I always found it interesting that for some reason, this technology, it excites people to the point where they're like, well, there has to be something different and special rules for this, when really it's, as you said, no different than the bow and arrow back in the day. It's just a progression of that kind of ability to wage war from a distance that we've always wanted to achieve.
But when you look at if you look at the standards that which drone strikes are measured in terms of collateral damage,
So high.
I would argue that they're higher than anything you've ever seen
Totally
in
agree.
man versus man,
Yes.
which, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that in the court of public opinion, that's where the conversation has gone, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And even domestically, as we were looking at the military policy for that, and I was helping in that thought process in the DoD, domestic imagery working group, there was this idea that, well, if it's a drone, then you have to get Secretary of Defense approval, just to even fly it over a flood, like to help the civil authorities, which we call Defense Supportive Civil Authorities, or DISCA. We came off of that in 2018. We were able to delegate some of that down, but there's still that idea that because, it's a drone, that somehow we have to ratchet up approval authorities and kind of the oversight of that. Whereas if it's any other weapon, not so much. So I totally agree with you, General Cantwell, that the standard that drone operators and drone operations are held to is much higher than I'd say any other, even your F-16.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so we are getting super close to the end. I would just love to ask you, do you have any closing comments before we dial off?
Yeah, Don, what I'll say, first of all, thanks so much for a few minutes today. It's like I said, it's great seeing you. And I'm so glad that you are continuing to promote the drone conversation, because when I met you at the Air Force Academy, I found it so fascinating that I had been studying drones for a long time. You'd been studying drones for a long time, and there were completely different aspects of drones. Yes. And so there's just so many aspects of this that if they're going to continue to advance, these different conversations have to continue in order to advance them in the right way, because there is so much potential to improve the quality of life and to protect our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and guardians that are out there on the battle space. But if we don't have these conversations, it will never happen. And I believe that the key to the U.S. Air Force promoting them faster than our adversary is going back to what I talked about earlier, trying to figure out what are those differences from manned aviation and figure out the new doctrine. What is the new doctrine that unmanned technologies bring that allow us to operate unmanned aircraft in a way that manned aircraft could never have done back in the 20th century? Thanks again, Don, for a few minutes today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'll tell you what, I think we can all rest easy knowing that people like you, General Cantwell, will be helping shape that new doctrine, because I agree. I think there's some best practices from manned aviation, like the maintenance mentality, the safety management systems, all of those things that we've imported to, as you said, make the best unmanned aircraft, force on the planet, but also then that next wave of how can we do this different and better to be even more effective? So thank you so much for your time, your perspective. This was absolutely amazing. For everybody out there, again, tomorrow on Clubhouse, we're going to have Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Phelps. He's going to really continue this conversation with his book, about his book on killing remotely. So please join us on Clubhouse at 1 p.m. Eastern. And then next week will be our last week for Defenders Month. We have, I call him the man, the myth, the legend, my mentor, the person that helped inspire me create my company, Major General retired United States Air Force James Poss. And General Poss, I can't wait to get him on here next week as well. So thank you so much. That's a wrap. We are out here. See ya.